The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1882, and Miranda Foster's hands trembled as she read the words that would change everything. Her uncle Samuel had died and left her his saloon in Rhyolite, Nevada, a property she hadn't known existed until that very moment. Miranda stood in the cramped Boston boarding house where she had lived for the past 3 years, working as a seamstress to survive after her parents passed from fever. The telegram explained that her uncle's lawyer required her presence immediately to claim the inheritance. She had only vague memories of Uncle Samuel, a rough-voiced man who had visited once when she was a child, smelling of tobacco and whiskey, spinning tales of silver mines and desert sunsets that her mother had dismissed as foolishness. Now he was gone, and somehow, impossibly, he had remembered her. The journey west took 2 weeks by train, and with each passing mile, Miranda felt the weight of her corset and heavy skirts becoming more oppressive in the increasing heat. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and heading toward a future she could not begin to imagine. The other passengers spoke in hushed tones about Nevada, about lawlessness and desperados, about fortunes made and lost in a single card game. Miranda clutched her carpetbag closer and tried not to think about what awaited her. Rhyolite emerged from the desert like a fever dream. The town sprawled across the rocky landscape, a collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents that seemed to shimmer in the relentless sun. Silver had been discovered here just a few years prior, and the town had exploded almost overnight with miners, merchants, gamblers, and those who preyed on them all. Miranda stepped off the stagecoach onto the dusty Main Street, her Eastern dress already wilting in the dry heat, and felt utterly, completely alone. The lawyer's office was a small structure wedged between a general store and what appeared to be a brothel. Mr. Henderson was a wiry man with spectacles that reflected the harsh desert light. He regarded Miranda with something between pity and concern as he laid out the situation. "Miss Foster, I will be frank with you. Your uncle's establishment, the Silver Dollar Saloon, is not what I would call a respectable property for a young lady." He shuffled papers on his desk nervously. "Samuel ran it for 15 years, and it has a certain reputation. The clientele are rough men, miners mostly, but also drifters, card sharps, and I am sorry to say, wanted men." Miranda's throat went dry. "Wanted men? You mean outlaws?" "The law is somewhat flexible here in Rhyolite," Henderson said carefully. "Your uncle had an arrangement with the sheriff. The saloon was considered neutral ground. Men could drink there without fear of arrest, so long as they caused no trouble within the town itself. It kept the peace in its way." "That sounds like harboring criminals," Miranda said, her voice sharper than she intended. "That sounds like survival," Henderson replied. "Your uncle was not a bad man, Miss Foster. He simply understood how things work out here. Now, you have inherited the property, the liquor stock, and all associated assets. You also inherit that arrangement with the law, should you choose to continue operating the establishment." Miranda felt dizzy. "And if I choose not to, you could sell, though I doubt you would find many buyers willing to take on such a property. Or you could close it, but that would anger a great many dangerous men who consider the Silver Dollar their sanctuary. Your uncle kept them fed, watered, and safe. They will expect you to do the same." The reality settled over Miranda like a heavy cloak. She had come west with nothing, and now she owned a saloon full of outlaws. She could refuse the inheritance and return to Boston with empty pockets, or she could step into a world she did not understand and hope she survived it. "I would like to see the property," she said finally. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the end of the Main Street, a 2-story building with a false front that made it look grander than it was. The paint had long since faded, and the wooden steps creaked ominously under Miranda's boots. Henderson pushed open the door and the smell hit her first: stale beer, tobacco smoke, sweat, and something else she could not quite name. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust. The main room was larger than she expected, with a long bar running along one wall, tables scattered across the floor, and a piano in the corner that looked like it had seen better days. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, where Henderson explained her uncle had kept his private quarters. But what struck Miranda most were the men. There were perhaps a dozen of them, even at this early hour. They sat at tables playing cards or hunched over drinks at the bar. They were weathered, hard-faced men in dusty clothes and worn boots, with guns at their hips and suspicion in their eyes. Every single one of them turned to stare as Miranda entered. The silence stretched out, thick and dangerous. Then a man at one of the tables, a heavy-set fellow with a scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Henderson, what the hell is this? Where's Samuel?" "Samuel passed 3 weeks ago, Burke." "This is his niece, Miranda Foster. She has inherited the property." The muttering that followed was low and angry. Miranda forced herself to stand straight to meet their hostile gazes even as her heart hammered in her chest. These were the wanted men, she realized. These were the outlaws her uncle had sheltered. "A woman cannot run this place," another man said, standing up from his chair. He was tall and lean, with a pistol on each hip. "No offense, miss, but you should head back east where you belong." "Thank you for your concern," Miranda said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But this is my property now, and I intend to honor my uncle's memory by maintaining his establishment." "Maintaining it?" The scarred man, Burke, laughed without humor. "You do not know the first thing about running a saloon, especially not this one. Samuel had agreements, understandings. You cannot just walk in here and expect everything to continue as it was." "Then perhaps someone should explain these agreements to me," Miranda said. She moved further into the room, forcing herself not to flinch as the men continued to stare. "My uncle built something here, something that mattered to all of you. I would be a fool to destroy that without understanding it first." A voice spoke from the far end of the bar, quiet but clear. "She has a point." Miranda turned toward the sound. A man sat alone at the bar, and she wondered how she had missed him initially. He was younger than most of the others, perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green. Unlike the others, he was not watching her with hostility, but with something more like curiosity. His clothes were worn but clean, and though he had a gun at his hip, his hands rested calmly on the bar, nowhere near the weapon. "Nobody asked you, Sawyer," Burke growled. The young man, Sawyer, shrugged slightly. "Samuel's dead. His niece owns the place legally. We can either work with her or find ourselves a new sanctuary, and good luck with that. Every other saloon in town will hand us over to the law the moment we walk through the door. So we are supposed to trust some Eastern girl who probably faints at the sight of blood," another man challenged. "I am suggesting we give her a chance to prove herself before we run her off," Sawyer said. He turned his attention fully to Miranda, and she felt the weight of that gaze. "Can you pour a drink, Miss Foster?" "I imagine I can manage," Miranda said, though she had never done such a thing in her life. "Then how about you pour one for every man in this room? On the house, as a gesture of goodwill. We will drink to Samuel's memory and see if we cannot figure out an arrangement that works for everyone." It was not a perfect solution, but it was better than the outright hostility of moments before. Miranda looked to Henderson, who nodded slightly. Then she moved behind the bar. The bottles lined up on the shelves meant nothing to her. She could not tell whiskey from brandy by sight. She reached for one at random and began pouring into the glasses that sat on the counter. Her hands shook only slightly as she worked her way through the room, setting drinks in front of men who looked like they could kill her without a second thought. Some nodded thanks, others just grunted, but no one threw the drink back in her face, which she took as a small victory. When she reached Sawyer at the bar, she set a glass in front of him and met his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for speaking up." He looked at the glass for a long moment, then pushed it gently away. "I appreciate the gesture, Miss Foster, but I do not drink. Not anymore." Miranda blinked in surprise. "You are in a saloon full of wanted men and you do not drink." "I am in a saloon full of wanted men because I have nowhere else to go," Sawyer said. "But I learned the hard way that whiskey makes me stupid, and stupid gets you killed out here. So I will stay sober. Thank you all the same." There was something about the way he said it, a quiet conviction that spoke of hard lessons learned, that made Miranda trust him more than anyone else in the room. She nodded and moved on, finishing her rounds and returning to stand behind the bar, feeling exposed and uncertain but also strangely determined. Burke raised his glass. "To Samuel," he said gruffly. "The old bastard kept us alive when the rest of the world wanted us dead." "To Samuel," the others echoed, and they drank. Henderson cleared his throat. "I will leave you to get acquainted with your new property, Miss Foster. My office is available should you need legal counsel." He tipped his hat and hurried out, clearly relieved to escape the tension. Miranda found herself alone with a room full of outlaws and no idea what to do next. The men returned to their card games and drinks, the initial crisis apparently averted, but she could feel them watching her, judging her every move. Sawyer remained at the bar, and after a moment he spoke again. "You should know what you are dealing with, Miss Foster." "May I be frank, please?" Miranda said, grateful for any guidance. "Most of the men here are wanted for crimes ranging from theft to murder. Some are guilty, some were framed, some fell in with bad crowds and could not get out. Your uncle gave them a place to rest without looking over their shoulders, and in return they kept the peace and did not bring trouble to his door. The sheriff, Tom Briggs, tolerates this arrangement because it keeps the outlaws contained and prevents gunfights in the streets." "And you?" Miranda asked. "What are you wanted for?" Sawyer's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I killed a man in Colorado 3 years ago, shot him in a saloon very much like this one. He was cheating at cards and called me a liar when I pointed it out. He drew first, but that did not matter to the law. His family had money and influence and I had neither, so I ran and I have been running ever since." "Was he cheating?" Miranda asked. "Yes," Sawyer said simply, "but that does not make me any less of a killer." The honesty was startling. Miranda had expected lies or justifications, but Sawyer seemed to have no interest in making himself look better than he was. She appreciated that more than he could know. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. I may not answer." "Why did you help me just now?" "The others wanted to drive me out." Sawyer considered the question, his fingers tracing patterns on the bar. "Because your uncle was kind to me when I first came here. I was half-starved and desperate, and he gave me food and a safe place to sleep without asking questions. I owed him a debt, and I suppose now I owe it to you. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I am curious to see if an Eastern lady can survive running an outlaw saloon. It should be interesting." Despite everything, Miranda found herself smiling back. "I suppose it should." The first week was harder than anything Miranda had ever experienced. She moved into her uncle's quarters on the second floor, a sparse set of rooms that smelled of tobacco and loneliness. The saloon operated from noon until well past midnight, and she quickly learned the rhythm of the place. The afternoon drinkers who came to escape the heat, The evening card games that sometimes turned violent, the late-night desperation of men who had nowhere else to go. She learned to pour drinks with reasonable accuracy, though she still mixed up the bottles sometimes. She learned which men would pay their tabs and which needed reminding. She learned to break up arguments before they turned into fistfights, and when to step back and let the men settle things themselves. It was brutal, exhausting work, and she fell into bed, each night bone-tired and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. But Sawyer helped. He never stated it outright, never made a formal offer of assistance, but he was always there when she needed him. When a miner got too rough with his demands, Sawyer would materialize at her elbow with a quiet word that somehow diffused the situation. When she could not lift a barrel of beer from the cellar, he would appear to help without being asked. When she struggled to balance the books her uncle had kept so meticulously, Sawyer sat beside her at the corner table and explained the numbers until they made sense. "You do not have to do this," she told him one evening after he had helped clear tables following a particularly rowdy night. "I did not hire you as a worker." "You did not hire anyone," Sawyer pointed out. "But someone has to keep you from getting killed by your own inexperience, and I figure it might as well be me." "Why?" Miranda asked, genuinely curious. "You said you owed my uncle a debt, but surely helping me for a week has repaid that." Sawyer was quiet for a long moment, stacking chairs with deliberate care. "Maybe I like having something to do," he said finally. "The other men here, they are content to drink and gamble and wait for whatever comes next, but that is no kind of life. Helping you gives me a purpose, even if it is just keeping a saloon running." Miranda studied him in the lamplight. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with strong features and careful hands. She had noticed that the other outlaws gave him a certain respect, even deference. He was younger than most of them, but there was something about him that commanded attention without demanding it. "What did you do before?" she asked. "Before Colorado, before running." "I was a rancher's son," Sawyer said, a hint of old pain in his voice. "Had a small spread with my father and brother. We raised cattle, broke horses, did honest work. Then my father died and my brother sold the ranch to pay his gambling debts. I drifted after that, picking up work where I could. Ended up in that Colorado saloon on the worst night of my life." "Do you miss it? The ranch?" "Every day," Sawyer admitted. "But that life is gone and there is no going back, so I make do with what I have." Something in his words resonated with Miranda. She too had lost everything and been forced to build a new life from the wreckage. Perhaps that was why she felt comfortable with him, why his presence did not frighten her the way the other outlaws did. As the weeks passed, a routine developed. Miranda ran the saloon during the day, serving drinks and food, managing supplies and finances. Sawyer helped where needed, but he also took on the role of unofficial mediator between Miranda and the more volatile customers. The other outlaws gradually accepted her presence, though she knew they were watching and waiting for her to fail. Burke, the scarred man, was the hardest to win over. He had been her uncle's closest friend, and he resented Miranda's inheritance. "Samuel should have left this place to someone who understands it," he told her one afternoon when the saloon was quiet. "Not some girl who does not know a Winchester from a water pump." "Then teach me," Miranda said, meeting his hostile gaze. "If you cared about my uncle, help me honor his legacy instead of waiting for me to fail." Burke stared at her for a long moment, then barked out a harsh laugh. "You got spine, I will give you that. Fine. First lesson, never let a man run a tab for more than a week. After that, you cut him off until he pays." Samuel was too soft about that, and it cost him money. It was a small concession, but it felt like a victory. Gradually, Burke warmed to her, and with his grudging acceptance came the acceptance of others. The silver dollar continued to operate as it always had, a sanctuary for wanted men who needed a place to rest before moving on. But the world outside the saloon did not stay still. In early May, a U.S. Marshal named Dawson rode into Rhyolite with a handful of deputies and warrants for several men known to frequent the silver dollar. Sheriff Briggs met him in the street outside the saloon, and Miranda watched from the window as the two lawmen argued in harsh whispers. Sawyer appeared at her shoulder, his face grim. "This is trouble." "Will they come inside?" Miranda asked, her heart racing. Briggs is trying to hold the line, but Dawson does not care about local arrangements. Federal marshals answer to a higher authority. As if summoned by their words, the door swung open, and Marshal Dawson strode inside. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and cold eyes that swept the room with practiced efficiency. The outlaws froze, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "Nobody move," Dawson said, his voice carrying easily. "I have warrants for the arrest of Jacob Burke, William Hayes, and Sawyer Novak. The three of you will surrender peacefully, or I will take you by force." The tension was thick enough to cut. Burke slowly stood from his table, his hand hovering near his gun. "This is neutral ground, Marshal. Sheriff Briggs can confirm that." "I do not recognize neutral ground when it comes to harboring federal fugitives," Dawson said. "You can come with me alive, or I can drag your bodies out." "Your choice." Miranda's mind raced. If shooting started, innocent people could die, and the careful balance her uncle had maintained would shatter. Without thinking, she stepped forward into the space between the marshal and the outlaws. "Marshal Dawson, my name is Miranda Foster. I own this establishment. Perhaps we can discuss this matter reasonably." Dawson's cold gaze fixed on her. "Step aside, miss. This does not concern you." "It concerns me very much when armed men threaten violence in my saloon," Miranda said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "These men have not broken any laws while under my roof. Whatever they may have done elsewhere is between them and the courts, but I will not have blood spilled here." "Noble words from a woman harboring criminals," Dawson said, "but the law is the law. Now step aside before I arrest you for obstruction." Sawyer moved then, positioning himself beside Miranda. "The lady asked you to be reasonable, Marshal. Maybe you should listen." "And who are you?" Dawson demanded. "Nobody important," Sawyer said. "Just someone who would prefer not to see a shootout today." The moment hung balanced on a knife's edge. Then Sheriff Briggs pushed through the door, breathing hard. "Marshal Dawson, a word outside. Now." Dawson looked ready to refuse, but something in Briggs's expression made him reconsider. "This is not over," he said, then turned and strode back out into the sunlight. The moment he was gone, the room exploded into chaos. Men shouted questions and curses, reaching for guns and bottles alike. Burke grabbed his hat and headed for the back door. "I am not waiting around to be arrested. Any man with sense will do the same." "Burke, wait," Miranda called, but he was already gone and two others followed him. Sawyer caught her arm gently. "Let them go. They know how to disappear." "What will happen now?" Miranda asked, feeling the fragile peace she had built crumbling around her. "Briggs will stall Dawson as long as he can, but eventually the marshal will come back, and next time he will bring more men. The arrangement your uncle had is falling apart." Miranda sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I cannot protect them. I do not have that kind of power." "No," Sawyer agreed, "but you can give them time to run. Sometimes that is all anyone can do." Over the next few days, several of the regular outlaws left town quietly, slipping away before the marshal could organize his next move. The silver dollar grew quieter, the tables less full, the atmosphere more subdued. Miranda found herself feeling the loss more than she expected. These were dangerous men, yes, but they had been her customers, her responsibility in a strange way. Sawyer remained. Miranda did not ask him why, did not question his decision to stay when others fled, but she was grateful for his presence. He had become something like a friend in the chaos of her new life, and she relied on his steady calm more than she cared to admit. One evening, after closing time, they sat together at the bar sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese. The saloon was empty except for them, the silence almost peaceful after the usual noise. "Can I ask you something personal?" Miranda said, pouring herself a glass of water. "You can ask," Sawyer said, as he always did. "Why do you not drink? You mentioned you had learned a hard lesson, but you never explained." Sawyer was quiet for so long that Miranda thought he might not answer. Then he sighed and set down his bread. "When I killed that man in Colorado, I was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but enough that my judgment was impaired, my temper shorter. If I had been sober, I might have walked away from his insults. I might have found another way to handle the situation. Instead, I let whiskey make my decisions, and a man died because of it." "It was self-defense," Miranda said gently. "You said he drew first." "He did. But I put myself in that position. I chose to drink, chose to gamble with men I did not know, chose to care about being called a liar. Those were my choices, and I have to live with the consequences. So I do not drink anymore. It is the only control I have left over my life." Miranda reached out and touched his hand, a brief gesture of comfort. "That takes strength. Most men would not have that kind of discipline." Sawyer looked at her hand on his, and something shifted in his expression. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect? A frightened girl who would run back east at the first sign of trouble, or maybe a hard woman who would turn the saloon into something ugly. But you are neither of those things. You are strong in ways I did not anticipate." Miranda felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am terrified most of the time," she admitted. "I have no idea what I am doing." "That is what makes it brave," Sawyer said. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." They sat in comfortable silence, and Miranda realized with a start that she had grown fond of this quiet outlaw with his careful words and steady presence. It was not something she had planned or even wanted, but feelings rarely consulted logic before taking root. The situation with Marshal Dawson came to a head 2 weeks later. He returned to the Silver Dollar with 6 deputies and a writ signed by a federal judge. "I have authorization to search this premise for wanted fugitives," he announced. "Anyone who resists will be arrested." There were only a handful of men in the saloon that afternoon, and none of them were on the marshal's list. Sawyer sat at his usual spot at the bar, watching calmly as the deputies searched the building. Miranda stood rigid with anger as they tore through her private quarters, overturning furniture and rifling through her possessions. "This is harassment," she told Dawson. "You know those men are gone." "I know nothing of the sort," Dawson replied. "But I am making it clear that this establishment no longer enjoys special protection. If I find wanted men here, I will arrest them, and I will arrest you as an accomplice." "Then I suppose it is fortunate that you have found no one," Miranda said coldly. Dawson leaned in close, his voice low and threatening. "You think you are clever, girl, but you are playing a dangerous game. Those men you have been protecting are killers and thieves. Sooner or later they will turn on you, and when they do, no one will come to your aid." "I am not protecting anyone," Miranda said. "I am running a legitimate business. If you have evidence otherwise, arrest me. If not, get out of my saloon." For a moment she thought he might actually do it. Then Dawson stepped back and signaled his men. "We are done here, but I will be watching this place, Miss Foster. One mistake, and I will shut you down permanently." They left in a clatter of boots and spurs, and Miranda sagged against the bar, shaking with adrenaline and anger. "That was dangerous," Sawyer said quietly. "I know, but I will not be bullied by that man. He is serious about watching this place. You understand what that means?" Miranda nodded slowly. "It means the arrangement is truly over. The outlaws cannot come here anymore. Which means you need to decide what the silver dollar becomes now," Sawyer said. "A regular saloon serving regular customers, or you close the doors and walk away." It was a question Miranda had been avoiding, but now it stood before her, unavoidably. She looked around the empty room, at the bar her uncle had built, at the tables where desperate men had found brief peace. This place had meant something once. Could it mean something again? "I do not want to walk away," she said finally, "but I do not know how to move forward either." "Then maybe we figure it out together," Sawyer said. She turned to look at him, really look at him. "Why do you keep helping me? And do not say it is because you owed my uncle. That debt was repaid long ago." Sawyer held her gaze, and for the first time she saw uncertainty in his eyes. "Because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing this as a debt and started seeing it as something I wanted to do. Because you make me think that maybe there is more to life than just running and hiding. Because when I am around you, I remember what it felt like to be a better man." Miranda's breath caught. The air between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Sawyer, I know this is not appropriate," he said quickly. "You are a respectable woman and I am wanted by the law, but I cannot help how I feel and I thought you should know." Miranda's heart raced. She should step back, should put distance between herself and this dangerous man, but she did not want to. "I feel it too," she admitted softly. "I have tried not to, tried to tell myself it is just gratitude or loneliness, but it is more than that." Sawyer reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid. "This is complicated," he said. "Everything about my life is complicated now," Miranda replied with a shaky laugh. They stood there, hands clasped, crossing an invisible line that neither could uncross. It was reckless and probably foolish, but it also felt more real than anything Miranda had experienced in years. The next weeks brought changes to the silver dollar. With the outlaw clientele gone, Miranda refocused the business toward the miners and merchants of Rhyolite. She cleaned the place from top to bottom, replaced broken furniture, and even hired a cook to serve decent meals. Sawyer worked beside her, repairing the piano, fixing the sagging roof, transforming the saloon from a desperate refuge into something approaching respectable. They did not speak directly about what had passed between them, but it was there in every shared glance, every accidental touch, every moment of comfortable silence. Miranda found herself watching him work, admiring the easy strength in his movements, the careful way he approached every task. And sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. But the question of his wanted status hung between them like a shadow. He could not stay in Rhyolite forever. Eventually, someone would recognize him, and Marshal Dawson was still watching the saloon. They were living on borrowed time, and both knew it. One night in June, as they locked up the saloon after a surprisingly busy evening, Sawyer spoke the words they had both been avoiding. "I should leave. For your sake." Miranda's hand stilled on the door lock. "Why?" "Because my presence here puts you at risk. If Dawson finds out you have been harboring me, that we have been." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "That we have been what?" Miranda turned to face him. "Say it, Sawyer." He looked at her with such longing that it made her chest ache. "That I have fallen in love with you, that every day I stay makes it harder to imagine leaving, that I am being selfish by remaining here when I know I should run." Miranda closed the distance between them. "Then be selfish. Stay. Miranda, you do not understand what you are asking. I understand perfectly. You are wanted for a crime you committed in self-defense 3 years ago. The man you killed was a cheater and a bully, and his wealthy family used their influence to make you a fugitive. That is not justice, and I will not accept it as reason enough to lose you. Sawyer cupped her face gently in his hands. You are the bravest, most stubborn woman I have ever met. Is that a compliment? She asked, smiling despite the tears pricking her eyes. The highest one I can give. And then he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. But Miranda leaned into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened. It tasted of possibility and desperation, of two people who had found something precious in the midst of chaos. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sawyer rested his forehead against hers. This changes everything. Good, Miranda said. I am tired of everything staying the same. They began, carefully and quietly, to build something together. Sawyer moved from the boarding house, where he had been staying, into the small room adjacent to Miranda's quarters. To the outside world, he was simply the saloon's hired man, but behind closed doors, they were partners in every sense. Miranda had never been with a man before, and Sawyer was patient and tender as they navigated that intimacy. He made her feel safe and cherished, and she gave him something he had thought lost forever, a sense of home. But happiness, Miranda was learning, was fragile in the West. In July, a man rode into Rhyolite who recognized Sawyer from Colorado. His name was Garrett, and he had been in the saloon the night of the shooting. He cornered Sawyer outside the general store one morning and said, loud enough for passers-by to hear, I know you. You are Sawyer Novak, the man who killed Richard Perry. Sawyer went very still. My name is Sawyer Novak, and yes, I killed Perry in self-defense. That is not how the law sees it, Garrett said. There is a reward for your capture, $500. Miranda, who had been across the street, hurried over. What is happening here? Nothing that concerns you, miss, Garrett said with an unpleasant smile. Unless you have been sheltering a fugitive knowingly, that would make you an accomplice. Leave her out of this, Sawyer said, his voice hard. Oh, I do not think I will. The marshal will want to know that the silver dollar is still harboring wanted men. Seems like that is information worth sharing. Sawyer's hand moved toward his gun and Miranda grabbed his arm. Do not. It will only make things worse. Garrett laughed. Listen to your woman, Novak, though I suppose she will not be yours much longer, not when you are rotting in a jail cell. He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, heading directly toward the marshal's office. We have to leave, Sawyer said immediately. Right now, before Dawson comes. No, Miranda said firmly. Running will not solve anything. We need another solution. There is no other solution. I am wanted, and now Dawson knows I have been here. If I stay, I will be arrested and you will be implicated. Then we need to clear your name, Miranda said. The idea formed even as she spoke it. We go to Colorado and find witnesses who can testify that it was self-defense. We get the charges dropped properly. That is impossible. Perry's family controls the judge and the sheriff. No one will speak against them. Maybe not in Colorado, Miranda said, her mind racing. But federal marshals have authority everywhere. If we can get a federal judge to review the case, present evidence that the local trial was corrupt, you might have a chance. Sawyer stared at her. That is a long shot. It is the only shot we have. Otherwise you run forever or I lose you to a jail cell. I would rather fight, even if the odds are poor. Before Sawyer could respond, Marshal Dawson appeared at the end of the street with 2 deputies. Sawyer Novak, he called out. You are under arrest for the murder of Richard Perry in Denver, Colorado. Surrender peacefully. Sawyer looked at Miranda one last time, then stepped forward with his hands raised. "I will come willingly, but I want your word that Miss Foster will not be charged with anything. She did not know who I was." "That is for a judge to decide," Dawson said as his deputies moved to bind Sawyer's hands. "She did not know," Sawyer repeated, his voice rising. "She inherited a saloon full of strangers. I gave her a false name. She is innocent in this." Dawson considered, then nodded slowly. "If that is true, she has nothing to worry about, but she will need to give a statement." They took Sawyer to the small jail behind the sheriff's office. Miranda followed, refusing to be left behind. She watched them lock him in a cell, watched him sit on the narrow cot with his head in his hands, and felt something harden inside her. "I need to speak with you, Marshal," she said. In Dawson's temporary office, Miranda laid out everything she knew about the Colorado shooting. She told him about Perry's cheating, about the corrupt local law, about Sawyer's claim of self-defense. "He has been running for 3 years for a crime that any reasonable court would have dismissed," she finished. "That is not justice." Dawson listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "These are serious accusations, Miss Foster. Do you have any proof?" "Not yet. But if you give me time, I will find it. Delay the extradition to Colorado while I investigate." "I do not have authority to delay an extradition based on speculation," Dawson said. "Then petition a federal judge to review the case," Miranda pressed. "If there was corruption in the local proceedings, that is a federal matter." Dawson regarded her thoughtfully. "You care about this man." "I love him," Miranda said simply. "And I believe he is innocent of murder. If the law is truly about justice and not just enforcement, then you should care about that too." There was a long silence. Then Dawson sighed. "I will send a telegram to the federal circuit judge in Carson City explaining the situation. But I cannot promise anything. If he declines to review the case, Novak will be extradited." It was more than Miranda had dared hope for. "Thank you, Marshal. Do not thank me yet. And Miss Foster, if you are lying to protect a guilty man, you will face charges as an accomplice." "I am not lying," Miranda said steadily. She was allowed to visit Sawyer that evening. He stood when she entered the cell area, gripping the bars with white knuckles. "Dawson agreed to petition a federal judge in Carson City," Miranda said quickly. "It is not much, but it is a chance. Miranda, you should not be doing this. You should be distancing yourself from me, protecting your reputation and your business." "My business means nothing without you," she said, moving close to the bars. "And my reputation has never been particularly good anyway." He reached through the bars to touch her face. "I do not deserve you." "Probably not," she agreed with a shaky smile, "but you are stuck with me regardless." "If this does not work, if they extradite me, then I will follow you to Colorado and keep fighting," Miranda said. "I am not giving up on you, Sawyer Novak. You are going to have to accept that." He pulled her as close as the bars allowed and kissed her through the narrow gap, desperate and tender all at once. When they parted, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it more. I should have said it every day." "You will have plenty of time to say it," Miranda promised. "This is not over." But as she left the jail and walked back to the empty saloon, doubt crept in. What if the judge refused the review? What if there was no evidence to find? What if she lost him despite everything? She would not accept that. She could not. The next morning, Miranda closed the silver dollar and took the stage to Carson City. It was a day's journey through brutal heat, but she barely noticed the discomfort. She had to convince the federal judge to take this case, had to find a way to save Sawyer. Judge Harrison was a severe-looking man with white hair and sharp eyes. He received her in his chambers with obvious skepticism. "Miss Foster, I have received Marshal Dawson's telegram. He says you claim corruption in a Colorado murder trial. Yes, Your Honor. Samuel Novak killed a man in self-defense, but the victim's wealthy family used their influence to ensure he was charged with murder. Witnesses who could have testified on his behalf were intimidated into silence or fled town. The local judge and sheriff were in the family's pocket. These are serious accusations. What evidence do you have? Miranda's heart sank. She had no evidence, only Sawyer's word and her belief in his honesty. None yet, Your Honor, but if you grant a stay of extradition, I will find it. That is not how the law works, Miss Foster. I cannot halt legal proceedings based on faith. Then what about justice? Miranda demanded, her frustration boiling over. An innocent man is sitting in a cell because he was poor and his accuser was rich. If that does not merit investigation, what does? Judge Harrison's expression softened slightly. I understand your passion, but I need something more concrete. Bring me sworn statements from credible witnesses, documentation of misconduct, anything substantive, and I will consider reviewing the case. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was not a refusal. How much time do I have? Colorado is demanding immediate extradition. I can delay them for 2 weeks at most. 2 weeks to find evidence of corruption in a trial that had occurred 3 years ago in another state. It was impossible. But Miranda had learned in her months running the Silver Dollar that impossible simply meant difficult. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, already planning her next move. She sent telegrams from Carson City to every newspaper in Colorado, inquiring about the Perry case. She wrote to lawyers' associations and marshals' offices. She even wrote to the courthouse in the town where the trial had occurred, requesting transcripts. Then she returned to Rhyolite and visited Sawyer in his cell. I need names, she told him. Anyone who was in that saloon the night of the shooting, anyone who might have witnessed Perry cheating, anyone who knew his family's reputation. I need names and locations if you have them. Sawyer looked exhausted but hopeful as he rattled off what he could remember. There was a dealer named Frank Morris. He ran the card game. A bartender called Dutch never learned his real name. Some minors who were playing that night, but I do not know where they went afterward. And there was a woman, a saloon girl named Claire. She saw everything because she was serving drinks at our table. Where can I find them? Morris was a drifter, could be anywhere. Dutch might still be in that town, he owned the saloon. And Claire, I heard she moved to Denver after everything happened. It was not much, but it was a start. Miranda composed more telegrams and letters, reaching out to anyone who might have information. She spent her meager savings on telegram fees and postage, praying that something would come back in time. Days passed with agonizing slowness. The saloon sat closed, gathering dust. Miranda divided her time between the post office, hoping for responses, and the jail, sitting with Sawyer and trying to keep hope alive in both their hearts. You should reopen the saloon, Sawyer said during one visit. You are losing money every day, it sits empty. I do not care about the money, Miranda said. I care about you. But if this does not work, you will need that business. Promise me you will take care of yourself, no matter what happens. Do not talk like that, Miranda said fiercely. We are going to win this. I refuse to consider any other outcome. On the 8th day, a telegram arrived from Denver. A reporter had found Claire, the saloon girl, and she was willing to give a statement. Miranda's hands shook as she read the woman's words. Perry was cheating that night. Novak called him on it fair. Perry drew first and would have killed Novak if Novak had not been faster. The whole thing was self-defense, but Perry's father paid us all to say otherwise or stay quiet. I have lived with that guilt for 3 years. It was exactly what they needed. Miranda clutched the telegram to her chest and ran to the jail. "We have a witness," she told Sawyer breathlessly. "Someone who saw what really happened and is willing to testify." Hope blazed in his eyes. "Miranda, there is more. The reporter found 2 other people who were there that night. They are also willing to give statements. We have evidence, Sawyer. Real evidence." She took the telegrams to Marshal Dawson, then sent copies to Judge Harrison in Carson City via the fastest courier she could hire. "This proves corruption in the original trial," she told Dawson. "Witnesses were bribed or intimidated. That has to be grounds for review." Dawson read the statements carefully. "This is compelling," he admitted, "but the decision is not mine to make." "But you can recommend that the judge grant a review, can you not?" "I can, and I will." He looked at her with something like respect. "You are a determined woman, Miss Foster." "I am a woman in love," Miranda said. "That makes me dangerous." 3 days later, a telegram arrived from Judge Harrison. He was ordering a federal review of the Perry case and granting a stay of extradition until the review was complete. Sawyer would remain in Rhyolite custody, but he would not be sent to Colorado to face a corrupt court. Miranda ran to the jail with the telegram clutched in her hand. When she told Sawyer the news, he sank onto the cot and covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook, and Miranda realized he was crying. "It is not over yet," she said gently, kneeling outside the cell, "but it is a start." "I did not dare to hope," he said, his voice rough. "I thought I was going to lose everything, lose you, but you fought for me when I could not fight for myself." "That is what love means," Miranda said simply. The federal review took 6 weeks. Judge Harrison traveled to Colorado personally to interview witnesses and examine records. He uncovered evidence of bribes paid to the local sheriff and documented testimony that contradicted the official trial record. The saloon owner, Dutch, admitted under oath that Perry's father had threatened to burn down his establishment if he allowed any testimony favorable to Sawyer. In late September, Judge Harrison issued his ruling. The original murder conviction was set aside due to prosecutorial misconduct and judicial corruption. Sawyer was ordered to face a new trial under federal jurisdiction, but given the overwhelming evidence of self-defense, the judge indicated he would recommend dismissal of all charges pending a brief hearing. The hearing was held in Carson City in early October. Miranda sat in the courtroom as witnesses testified about Perry's cheating, his violent temper, his family's influence. Claire described in vivid detail how Perry had reached for his gun first, how Sawyer had acted only to save his own life. When Judge Harrison delivered his verdict, his voice was stern. The original proceedings in this case were a mockery of justice. An innocent man was convicted because he lacked wealth and influence, while the true aggressor was posthumously protected by his family's power. Such corruption cannot be tolerated in our legal system. He looked directly at Sawyer. "Mr. Novak, the charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are a free man." The courtroom erupted, but Miranda heard only the pounding of her own heart. Sawyer turned to her, his face transformed by relief and joy, and she launched herself into his arms. They held each other tightly, both crying, both laughing, both overwhelmed by the weight that had finally been lifted. Outside the courthouse, Sawyer took her hands in his. "Marry me," he said. "I know I have nothing to offer except a tarnished reputation and uncertain prospects, but I love you more than anything in this world. Marry me, Miranda." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 days later by a justice of the peace in Carson City, with Marshal Dawson and Sheriff Briggs serving as witnesses. It was not the grand wedding Miranda might have imagined as a girl, but it was perfect in its simplicity. Two people who had fought through hell for each other, finally free to build a life together. They returned to Rhyolite as husband and wife and reopened the Silver Dollar together. The saloon's reputation shifted under their joint management. It became known as a place of second chances, where honest men could find work and a fresh start. Sawyer used his knowledge of ranching to start a small horse trading operation on the side, buying wild mustangs from the desert and breaking them for sale to miners and travelers. Miranda expanded the saloon's offerings, adding a dining room that served proper meals and a small shop that sold supplies to prospectors heading into the hills. Together, they built something more stable than either had known before. Burke returned to Rhyolite a few months after the trial, having heard about Sawyer's exoneration. "Congratulations on beating the system," he said gruffly. "Samuel would have been proud." "Thank you," Miranda said. "Will you be staying?" Burke shook his head. "The martial days are over for me. I am heading to California, trying my luck in San Francisco. But I wanted to say goodbye proper and to tell you that you did right by this place. Your uncle's legacy is in good hands." It was the closest thing to a blessing Miranda had received from the old outlaw, and it meant more than she could express. As 1883 dawned, Miranda discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with both joy and terror. Bringing a child into the harsh world of Nevada mining town seemed reckless, but Sawyer's delight was so complete that she could not help but share it. "We will make it work," he promised, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "We will give this child a good life, a safe life." Their son was born in late August, delivered by the town's doctor in the upstairs room of the saloon. They named him Samuel, after Miranda's uncle, and he was healthy and strong-lunged. Sawyer held his son with such tenderness that Miranda fell in love with him all over again. The years that followed were not always easy. Rhyolite's silver began to play out, and many residents moved on to the next boom town. But the Silver Dollar persisted, serving the remaining population with good food, honest drink, and fair dealing. Sawyer's horse business grew, and he gained a reputation as one of the best trainers in Nevada. 2 years after Samuel's birth, Miranda gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. The saloon's second floor was converted into family quarters, and the sound of children's laughter filled the rooms where outlaws had once plotted their escapes. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Sawyer and Miranda stood on the porch of the Silver Dollar watching the sun set over the desert. Samuel played in the dust at their feet while Grace napped inside. "Do you ever regret it?" Sawyer asked. "Staying here, building this life." Miranda leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "Not for a moment, do you?" "I regret the years I lost running," he said. "But I do not regret anything that led me to you. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Miranda corrected. "You gave me courage when I had none. You taught me what it means to build something worth keeping." They stood in comfortable silence as the sky turned gold and purple. The Silver Dollar still bore the scars of its rougher days, but it had become something better: a home, a business, a symbol of redemption and new beginnings. In 1887, Sawyer was elected to the Rhyolite Town Council, his past fully forgiven by a community that valued his fairness and hard work. Miranda served on the committee to establish a proper schoolhouse, ensuring that their children and others would have access to education. Burke sent a letter from San Francisco announcing his engagement to a widow who ran a boarding house. "Who would have thought," he wrote, "that an old outlaw like me would find respectability? But then I remember you and Sawyer, and I realize anything is possible." As Rhyolite slowly declined with the fading silver, many urged Sawyer and Miranda to move to a larger town with better prospects. But they chose to stay, even as buildings around them were abandoned and the population dwindled. The silver dollar had been a sanctuary once. Now it was their home, and they would not abandon it. By 1890, Rhyolite was nearly a ghost town, but the silver dollar remained open, serving the few dozen stubborn souls who refused to leave. Samuel was 7 and Grace was 5, both bright children who knew the desert as their playground. Sawyer had established a small ranch on the outskirts of town, running cattle in addition to breaking horses. Miranda stood at the bar one evening, polishing glasses as she had done 1,000 times before. The saloon was quiet, just a few regulars playing cards in the corner. Sawyer sat at his usual spot at the bar, drinking coffee and reviewing their account books. "Remember the first day I walked in here?" Miranda asked. Sawyer looked up with a smile. "How could I forget? You poured drinks like you were serving poison and looked ready to bolt at any moment." "I was terrified." "You were brave," he corrected. "There is a difference." "You said you would stay sober," Miranda remembered. "That was the first thing that made me trust you." "Best decision I ever made," Sawyer said. "Well, second best. The first was helping you instead of running." "We have had a good life," Miranda said softly. "We have had a great life," Sawyer said, coming around the bar to put his arms around her. "And we are not done yet. 20 more years at least, I figure." "Only 20, Miranda teased. "Fine, 50. I plan to be old and gray and still madly in love with you." "That can be arranged," Miranda said and kissed him. Outside, the desert wind blew through the empty streets of Rhyolite, carrying sand and memories. But inside the silver dollar, warmth and life persisted. It was not the grand adventure Miranda had imagined when that telegram arrived 8 years ago, but it was something better. It was real, earned through struggle and sacrifice, built on love and trust, and the simple choice to stay when running would have been easier. The seasons turned. Samuel and Grace grew into capable young people who worked alongside their parents, learning the business and the values of honesty and hard work. The ranch prospered even as the town faded, and Sawyer's horses were sought after throughout Nevada. In 1895, on a warm spring evening, the family gathered for supper in the private quarters above the saloon. Samuel, now 12, announced his intention to become a lawyer. "Someone has to make sure innocent people do not suffer like you did, Pa," he said earnestly. Sawyer's eyes were bright with pride. "That is a fine ambition, son." Grace, 10 years old and already showing her mother's determination, declared she wanted to run the saloon when she grew up. "Someone has to keep the family business going," she said matter-of-factly. Miranda and Sawyer exchanged glances across the table, both thinking the same thing. Their children would have choices they never had, opportunities born from the stability their parents had fought so hard to create. After the children were in bed, Miranda and Sawyer walked through the empty saloon, checking locks and dousing lamps as they did every night. The place was worn but well maintained, every surface bearing the mark of their care. "I got a letter today," Sawyer said, "from Judge Harrison. He is retiring and wanted me to know that our case influenced his thinking on judicial reform. He has been pushing for oversight of local courts to prevent the kind of corruption we faced." "That is wonderful," Miranda said. "Something good came from all that pain." "Many good things came from it," Sawyer said, pulling her close. "I learned what I was capable of when I had something worth fighting for. I learned that the world is not as dark as I thought, that there are people like you who choose goodness even when it is hard." "I learned that strength comes in unexpected forms," Miranda said. "That a wanted man can be more honorable than those who make the laws. That love is worth any risk." They ascended the stairs to their bedroom, arms around each other, comfortable in the intimacy of 13 years together. Their life was not glamorous, would never be notable in the history books, but it was theirs, built moment by moment, choice by choice. The years continued their steady march. Samuel left for university in San Francisco in 1898, determined to study law and fight the injustices he had heard about all his life. Grace took over more of the saloon's daily operations, proving herself as capable as her mother. In 1900, Rhyolite was officially declared a ghost town by the territorial government, but the Novak family remained. They had expanded the ranch significantly, and the Silver Dollar served as a way station for travelers crossing the desert. It was a different life than Miranda had expected, but it was good and full and theirs. One evening in early spring of 1902, as Miranda and Sawyer sat on the porch watching the sunset, Grace came running from the main road. "Ma, Pa, Samuel is coming. I saw the dust from his wagon." They rose to greet their son, who had completed his law studies and was returning home to set up practice in a larger town nearby. But as the wagon drew closer, they saw he was not alone. A young woman sat beside him, dark-haired and smiling. "Ma, Pa, Grace, this is Elizabeth," Samuel said, helping the woman down. "My wife. We were married last month in San Francisco." There were tears and embraces, joy and celebration. That night, the Silver Dollar hosted its first real party in years, with neighbors from the scattered ranches coming to welcome the young couple. Music and laughter filled the old saloon, and for a brief moment, it felt like the early days again, full of life and possibility. As the party wound down, Sawyer found Miranda on the porch, watching the stars. "20 years," he said. "Can you believe it has been 20 years since you inherited this place?" "20 years since my life truly began," Miranda said. "I was just existing before, going through motions. But here with you I have lived." "We have both lived," Sawyer agreed, "and loved, and built something that will outlast us." "Samuel will do great things," Miranda said. "He has your sense of justice and my stubbornness." "Dangerous combination," Sawyer said with a laugh. "But I pity anyone who tries to stand in his way." They stood together in the desert night, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and had built a life of meaning and love. The saloon that had once sheltered wanted men now sheltered a family, and that felt like the truest kind of redemption. Grace eventually married a rancher from a neighboring spread, and together, they expanded the horse business into one of the most successful operations in Nevada. She never did take over the saloon, but she convinced her parents to convert it into a proper boarding house for travelers, which proved quite profitable. Samuel established his law practice and became known throughout Nevada as a defender of those without means or power. He never forgot the story of his father's wrongful conviction, and he spent his career ensuring others did not suffer the same fate. In 1910, Sawyer and Miranda celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends who had become family. The boarding house was full of guests. The ranch was thriving, and they had lived to see their children succeed beyond their wildest dreams. "No regrets?" Sawyer asked Miranda as they danced slowly to music from the old piano, finally repaired properly after all these years. "Not a single one," Miranda said, "though I still remember how terrified I was that first day, walking into a saloon full of outlaws." "I remember thinking you would not last a week," Sawyer admitted. "You proved me wrong in the best possible way." "You said you would stay sober," Miranda recalled. "That was when I knew you were different." "And you said you would fight for me when anyone else would have run," Sawyer replied. "That was when I knew I was the luckiest man alive." They continued to dance. As the sun set over the desert they had made their home. Two people who had started with nothing but determination and love, and had built an empire of the heart that would echo through generations. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but it had given them each other, and that had made all the difference. Years later, when they were old and gray, sitting on the porch of the ranch house they had built together, their great-grandchildren playing in the yard, Miranda would reflect on that telegram that had arrived so long ago. It had promised an inheritance, but she had received so much more: a purpose, a partner, a love that had defied law and logic and convention. "Thank you," she said to Sawyer one evening, though he had not asked a question. "For what?" he said, his voice still warm despite his age. "For staying sober that day, for helping me when you could have walked away, for loving me even when it was dangerous, for building this life with me." Sawyer took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "Thank you for seeing past the wanted poster to the man underneath. For fighting for me when I had stopped fighting for myself. For choosing me every day, even when easier options existed. For being the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat in comfortable silence as the desert painted itself in sunset colors. Two people who had weathered every storm together and had emerged stronger for it. The silver dollar was long since converted. The outlaw days were distant memory. But the love they had forged in that desperate time remained as solid as the mountains on the horizon. Miranda Foster Novak died peacefully in her sleep in 1925 at the age of 66, surrounded by family who had gathered to celebrate her birthday. Sawyer Novak followed her 6 months later, unable to bear the world without her in it. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, with a simple stone that read, "They built a life from love and courage." Their children ensured that the story was never forgotten, passing it down through generations. The old silver dollar building still stood decades later, a weathered testament to the woman who had inherited a saloon full of wanted men and had transformed it into something beautiful. And in family gatherings, when grandchildren asked about their legacy, someone would always tell the story of the cowboy at the bar who said he would stay sober, and the brave woman who had loved him enough to change both their destinies. It was a story of the Wild West, but more than that, it was a story of two people who had found each other in the chaos and had held on tight, building something lasting from the dust and danger. It was a story of second chances and stubborn love, of justice delayed but never denied, of a woman who had come west with nothing and had gained everything that mattered. And though Rhyolite eventually crumbled into true ruins, though the silver played out and the miners moved on, though the very landscape changed with time, the love between Miranda and Sawyer remained immortal, passed down in stories and memories. A reminder that even in the harshest environments, even when the odds seemed impossible, love could not only survive but flourish. The desert wind still blows through Nevada, carrying with it the whispers of 1,000 stories. But among all those tales of fortune and failure, of violence and valor, the story of Miranda and Sawyer stands out as something rare and precious. A love story that began in darkness and ended in light. A romance forged in the fire of the Wild West and tempered into something unbreakable. They had started as strangers in a saloon full of desperate men, and they had ended as partners who had built an empire of love and family and purpose. It was not the story Miranda had expected when that telegram arrived, announcing an inheritance she had never known existed. But it was the story she needed, the life she was meant to live, the love that was worth every risk. And if you listen carefully to the wind in Nevada, especially near the ruins of old Rhyolite, you can still hear the echo of their love. A cowboy's promise to stay sober, a woman's determination to fight for justice, and the life they built together against all odds. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most desperate circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. The Wild West was a place of legends, but the greatest legend of all was not about gunslingers or gold strikes. It was about two people who found each other in the chaos and chose, every single day, to build a life together. It was about a woman who inherited a saloon full of wanted men, and discovered that sometimes the most wanted man of all is the one who stays when everyone else would run, who promises sobriety in a world of excess, who loves with his whole heart despite having every reason to guard it. And it was about a man who found redemption not through running or hiding, but through loving a woman brave enough to fight for him when the whole world said he was not worth saving. Together, they proved that the West was not just wild, but also full of possibility, full of second chances, full of love stories waiting to be written in the dust and heat and endless sky. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death and memory. But the love they built survived them, living on in children and grandchildren, in the land they had tended, in the values they had embodied. The Silver Dollar Saloon that had once sheltered outlaws became a symbol of transformation, proof that even the roughest beginnings could lead to beautiful endings. And so the story concludes, not with sadness but with satisfaction, not with tragedy but with triumph. Miranda Foster came west as an orphaned seamstress with nothing to her name. She died as Miranda Novak, matriarch of a family that had spread throughout Nevada and beyond, a woman who had run a business, raised children, fought corruption, and loved with a fierceness that inspired everyone who knew her story. Sawyer Novak came west as a fugitive, running from a crime he committed only to save his own life. He died as a respected rancher, father, grandfather, and town elder, a man who had proven that past mistakes do not define future possibilities, that redemption is always possible for those willing to work for it. Together, they had written a love story for the ages, one that began with an inheritance and a promise, and ended with a legacy that would never fade. The Wild West claimed many victims, but it also created heroes, and Miranda and Sawyer were heroes of the truest kind. Ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and chose love, chose courage, chose each other. Their story is over, but it echoes still, a reminder that even in the hardest places, even in the most desperate times, love can bloom and flourish and last. All it takes is a woman brave enough to stay, and a man brave enough to promise sobriety in a saloon full of wanted men. Everything else follows from that first choice, that initial moment of trust that changes everything. The sun sets over Nevada one last time in this story, painting the desert in gold and crimson. And somewhere in those colors is the memory of two people who loved well and lived fully and left the world better than they found it. That is all any love story can hope to achieve, and Miranda and Sawyer achieved it with grace and grit, and an unshakable commitment to each other that survived every challenge the Wild West could throw at them. And so we leave them there, in memory and legacy, in the stories their descendants still tell, in the ruins of a saloon that once meant everything. We leave them in love, which is the only way their story could possibly end. The Wild West was many things, but for Miranda Foster and Sawyer Novak, it was the place where they found each other, fought for each other, and built a love that time itself could not diminish. Their story is complete. Their love is eternal. And the lesson they left behind is simple but profound. Sometimes the most wanted man in the world is the one who promises to stay sober, and the bravest woman is the one who believes him enough to risk everything. From that foundation, miracles can grow, love can flourish, and even a saloon full of wanted men can become a home.